So Ellen will be sharing about the life cycle and life history needs of monarchs. She has been employed as a biologist with NRCS for 23 years. The past 15 years, she has been an active advocate for pollinators and their native habitat, both professionally and personally, to inspire others to provide habitat for the insects. She started a 2,400 square foot pollinator garden in May of 2014 by the Princeton Public Library on property owned and supported by the city of Princeton. Her passion is ecosystem restoration to bring back much needed native habitat, not only for wildlife, but for human life also.
Thank you for the introduction, Elise, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm so glad to be here to have the opportunity to talk to you today about the magnificent monarch, the Illinois state butterfly. A most beloved monarch and well known by many, an iconic butterfly whose decline has captured the attention of many of us throughout the continent. Just in case you didn't know, the male monarchs on the right of the slide there can be distinguished from females, and she's depicted on the left. So the male has a dark spot or a patch on the vein of each hind wing. These are called androconial patches and are made of specialized scales which contain pheromones used in courtship. While the female has wider veins and the male is duller, female has wider veins than the male and is duller in color than the male. And the males and females are approximately the same size. There are two distinct populations of monarchs in North America, the eastern and western monarch population. Both are in decline, while this past year, 2020, the western population experienced a very large decline. The western population is located on the west coast, and they migrate from the Great Northwest and overwinter in California. They don't go to central Mexico like the eastern population. Today, I'll be talking to you about the eastern population. Scientists measure their population by how many hectares or acres the butterflies cover on the Oyamela fir trees in central Mexico. In 2013-14, they experienced a historic low where the entire eastern population only occupied 1.7 acres. The winter of 2019, monarchs covered about 7, while this past winter declined to about 5. Their populations experience a lot of fluctuation from year to year, and that is just the nature of insects. In the last 25 years, monarch populations have plunged by the hundreds of millions. It's according to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's Species Status Assessment Report. Scientists estimate 15 acres are needed to sustain their population. Well, we're about a third of that right now. And as you can see on the bar graph here, in 1996-97, the overwintering population occupied about 45 acres. And then plummeted to about 1.7 in 13-14, and since then has been up and down ever since. This past December in 2020, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service was tasked with determining if the butterfly should be a listed species, a federally listed species. While they are qualified to be listed on the Endangered Species Act, they'll have to wait their turn, as limited resources are directed to species with higher priority. There are many threats to their population, and the most recent major threats are human imposed. In their overwintering habitat in central Mexico, there's illegal logging of the Oyamel firs, which they land on. They crowd together on the branches, and there's so many butterflies on the branches, they pull the branches down. That's a lot of butterflies. That's where they overwinter in the mountains and just west of central Mexico, about 5,000 feet elevation. Also, abnormal freezing winter weather has occurred in central Mexico. And a few years ago, there was an ice storm that hit in March. Some of the butterflies had broke dormancy and started flying north, but a lot of them got caught in that ice storm and were frozen to death. So if there's a freezing temperatures at the wrong time of year, too early in the season, before they've left, we could lose the whole eastern population in one fell swoop. Once they reach the United States, habitat loss is another factor, and it's due to row crops and urban development. In 1996, glyphosate-resistant crops, also known as Roundup Ready, were introduced. Glyphosate application reduces the natal habitat, which are the milkweeds. Milkweeds are the only plant that monarchs lay their eggs on, and I'll tell you why a little bit later. Historically, milkweeds occurred throughout the cropland fields and along field edges, but that's been nearly eliminated with the wide use of glyphosate. Now, glyphosate was developed to reduce tillage coverage, tillage trips across the field to reduce weed competition, and also tillage would release carbon from the combustion of the fossil fuels. Also by tilling, you lose carbon from the soils and it compacts the soil. So they thought they were doing a good thing by having Roundup Ready or GMO type seed, but it's kind of backfired on the insects. Milkweed density in the Midwest was estimated to decline by 58% in just 11 years between 1999 and 2010. And we need to remember that insects are like the canary in the coal mine for our ecosystem health. So if they start to decline, that's nature's way of telling us something is wrong. So the increased use of glyphosate correlates with monarch population decline. Overall native habitat loss throughout the landscape follows this trend. In 1995, about 20 million acres were treated with glyphosate. And in 2013, over 155 million acres, and I'm sure it's way over that now. So it's an alarming amount of acreage treated with glyphosate, and they're finding a lot of other problems that glyphosate has caused in human health also. A large number of factors affect the population decline. A couple of natural, most human. As you can see on the slide, I have it highlighted in yellow. These are the natural factors, natural enemies, and competition from other herbivores. Dry conditions in Texas in April could have been a natural occurrence. More recently, possibly more of the climate change type weather patterns. Lepidoptera is the order of butterflies and moths and have a fascinating life cycle that involves metamorphosis. Metamorphosis is the process of transformation from an immature form to an adult form in 2 or more distinct stages. And as you can see, you have the female butterfly laying the egg. The caterpillar develops from the egg, goes through some different stages into the chrysalis, and eventually back to the butterfly again. The life cycle of lepidopterans consists of 4 stages: the egg, the larvae or the caterpillar, the pupa, or also known as the chrysalis, and the adult stage. Caterpillars eat only milkweed. That's why they're so important. They consume milkweed to ingest the milky sap that contains a poison called a cardinalid. Cardinalid is a toxin the plant produces as a defense mechanism to deter predators. And in turn, the caterpillars ingest the cardinalid toxin. Sometimes it kills them, but they've evolved with milkweed and over time have evolved a metabolism that can usually handle the cardinalid to metabolize that and incorporates that into their own body, which helps them deter predators. And one way they let predators know that they shouldn't be eaten are by their bright colors. So whenever you see brightly colored insects, they're warning their predators that somehow they don't taste good, might make them sick, and you know what, just might kill them, so you just better leave them alone. And the adults, they get their energy source from nectar. And the more diverse nectar sources they have, more floral diversity, the better off they'll sustain through their life cycles also. So here we have in more detail of the life cycle of the caterpillar. The egg is typically laid on the underside of the monarch leaf. That egg is really small. It's about the size of a pinhead. Once you train your eye for it, you can pick it out pretty readily, and it does have these little ridges on it. It's a beautiful little egg. And so when the larvae emerges, or the scientific term for the larvae emerging from the egg is called eclosion. It doesn't have any stripes, and it's really small because that egg's really small. Of course, you can kind of see when it's getting ready to eclose or emerge, you can see kind of a dark spot. The shell becomes more translucent, and it's kind of a darker spot in there. So you just keep watching it. If you ever raise monarchs, you know what I'm talking about. And that little guy is so small, the only thing that he can manage to eat are the hairs on the back of the leaf. So once he starts to bite into the tissue and starts to consume that milky sap, then he gets his stripes. I thought that was pretty neat. So the first instar stage, of course, is very small, and as they grow and they eat, all they do is eat and eliminate, and sleep, just like babies. So once it gets to a certain size, the skin can't expand anymore, and it splits the skin open, and the second instar stage is revealed. And the same thing happens until it reaches the fifth star end stage, and then it will hang upside down in the J stage. It will attach itself on the underside of something secure and hidden. They like to be hidden from predators because they're very vulnerable at this point. And then it starts a metamorphosis process. What really happens is it's a cellular change. Basically, that caterpillar forms that chrysalis, and once the chrysalis is hardened, it's liquid. It's liquid, it's rearranging, it's at a cellular level into the form of a butterfly. So it's quite fascinating. And it takes about a month from the egg to adult for the whole process to occur. These are organisms that can't control their own temperature. They depend on the air temperature. So the warmer it is, the faster the metabolism will go. So the faster this process will happen, not a whole lot faster, but maybe a few days faster. And conversely, the cooler it is, the slower this process is. We have a Monarch in the Making poster that myself and Kara Clark developed. She's at our state office. She's a fantastic graphic artist. And she took my photos. I told her how I wanted it. And we have this available. It's on a PDF form. It's on the Illinois NRCS Pollinator webpage. We also have hard copies. If anybody's unable to get one printed, we have quite a few at the state office. Just let us know, and we can mail you a few. We really like them to go to schools for educational purposes. But that's available for your use free of charge. Now, when the first generation ends up in the United States, the females lay eggs in Texas exclusively on milkweeds, and these are known as the host plants. So that's what we mean by host plants. That's what those critters, whatever they may be, use for their larval stage or the young stage. And then the adults go nectaring on a diverse number of forbs. purple coneflower, blazing star, to name a couple. And of course, they also nectar on the milkweed flowers. So the breeding generation, which we see here in Illinois, and usually by the time they reach Illinois, we're seeing possibly the third generation of butterflies that have migrated from central Mexico. They only live 2 to 6 weeks. And the reason for that being, they're in the reproductive stage. Their focus is to reproduce, to perpetuate the species. And it takes a lot of energy to reproduce. The male inserts a spermatophore. It's a packet of sperm and nutrients, proteins, and energy for the female so that she can carry out laying eggs. She can lay up to 400 eggs if she lives that long. She doesn't die before that. So that's why insect populations can increase or decrease so much. If they have good success in breeding, then their populations are really going to flourish. So the overwintering generation lives up to 9 months. This overwintering generation is known as the Methuselah generation. They live, well, compared to 2 to 6 weeks, that's a long time, 9 months. They enter a reproductive diapause, which is they just don't fully mature to be able to reproduce that last generation in late summer, early fall. They think that the shorter days, maybe the dying of the milkweeds, kind of trigger that response. They're not really sure, but that's what the scientists' best surmise would be. So it delays their full development, and it's called reproductive diapause, so that they can fly those 2,000 to 3,000 miles all the way. Some of them go up into Canada and then all the way down to central Mexico. It's just amazing. That's no other insect migrates that far that I know of. So like I said, they leave early August from the northern part of the continent to make it down to Mexico in early November. And for Illinois, the peak migration season is mid-September, typically. So don't cut your forbs down, leave your milkweed. They need that as little way stations on the way south. And then once in March, they'll break dormancy. Then they fully mature to be able to reproduce. They mate and head back north looking for some milkweeds. So they get into Texas when those milkweeds are first coming up. They're very fresh, young plants. And hopefully the timing's right, that plants will be available. One year I saw monarchs here in Illinois in April because there was a really strong south wind, real strong south wind in Texas for 2 weeks, sustained, and it blew the monarchs north too soon. And I just felt really, really bad that year for the first generation probably that made it to Illinois in an untimely manner there. I don't know if you folks know who figured out the migration route, but for years they didn't know where the monarchs went. And there was a Canadian entomologist, Dr. Fred Urquhart. He dedicated his life to research on the monarchs. He and his wife traveled all over the South trying to figure out where the monarchs went. He started in 1937, and then in 1975, they finally figured it out. And he's the one that started the tags on the wings and started Citizen Science Watch and the Monarch Watch organization. So I believe I provided a link for that. They're going to put that in the chat for you. So as the monarchs move into new areas in the spring, they find young host plants just days after the plants emerge on their own. And the females do seem to prefer new growth for their larvae, and they they believe that the leaves are more palatable when the plants are younger. And I've noticed that in my gardens around the house. I watch the females and they are going for the younger plants. Especially common milkweed, if you notice the older leaves, they're more leathery, and I'm sure it's more difficult for the larvae, especially those little guys that just first emerged or eclosed from the egg. It's kind of tough for them to consume. This iconic butterfly knows no political boundaries. As you saw in some of the slides, that they go from Canada to Mexico. So we have 3 political boundaries, and yet they know no boundaries, and they inspire international cooperation to save them. We can all contribute to the conservation of the iconic butterfly, whether we have a patio, a yard, or acres of land for establishing milkweed and native forbs. So what we need to do, what each of us can do in our own capacity, is to help protect native areas, if you have any on your property, and encourage production or reproduction of milkweed, and then also the flowering plants, the native forbs. And they're mostly prairie forbs, while there are, of course, some savanna and woodland forbs too that are beneficial to the butterfly. And trees, they like to roost in trees, especially if you've ever seen them gathering in the fall. They all seem to congregate and fly in number. I don't know if that's safety in number, or yeah, I don't know if anybody really knows, but they're so beautiful, clustered in the trees, gathering for the fall migration. And for the forbs, for the adult nectarine, which is really important in the fall to have an abundance of forbs for them, they use different species at different times of year for their life cycle needs. And so it's best if we plant a most diverse suite of native forbs for them. While there are 22 native species of milkweed, the host plant, in Illinois, 4 are endangered and 1 is threatened. And only 4 of these 22 are very readily available on the market at this time, especially in the seed form. There are a couple more that you can get in live plant form from certain native nurseries. One of the issues is milkweeds are pretty finicky when it comes to pod set, the seeds becoming mature, and then also germination. They're very finicky. A lot of them are susceptible to damp off, which is like a fungus that gets on the soil surface. But so we have swamp milkweed in the lower left, which is really good for wet sites. Common milkweed from somewhat poorly drained to drier sites. That is the milkweed that was all throughout the agricultural landscape prior to the extreme use of Roundup. Here we have the world milkweed. This is a wonderful, it's a shorter stature milkweed, very thin-leaved also, and it's really good for dry sites. It flourishes in sandy sites, less competition. You can go anywhere from mesic to dry to sandy, and butterfly milkweed can go anywhere from mesic or medium moisture to drier sites. And it has a very fuzzy leaf. So sometimes, and different plants have different amounts of fuzziness on their leaf, and it's thought that sometimes the monarchs don't prefer to lay their eggs on them. Seems like swamp milkweed is the most palatable. It has a very thin leaf, and if you have swamp milkweed, you're going to get a lot of monarchs on there. And I had to throw in meadow blazing star. It's a liatris or blazing star forb. It's not native to Illinois, but it's worth mention because it's the monarch magnet. It's native to west of the Mississippi, but I do have it in my gardens because I've had another species, Pycnostakia and Ligula stylus, growing just feet apart, and they never touch the Pycnostakia. They always land on the Ligula stylus. Anyway, I just had to mention that one. That's a really good one to have. And NRCS and Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation work, they're a nonprofit organization out of Portland, Oregon. They're entomologists, and we work very closely with them on our pollinator habitat and monarch habitat requirements, and to ensure that our seeding recommendations provide the needed species richness and abundance of forbs throughout their growing season for all insects. We've developed a list of monarch preferred forbs for the Midwest, and this consists of over 140 species of native forbs, and I've listed the genus here of those species just for quick reference. And of course, Asclepias is the host plant and a very important nectarine plant. Also, that would be the milkweed genus. Monarchs and Milkweeds is a fantastic read if you want to dive deep into the coevolution of the two species. And I think I forgot to mention that there are other insects that eat milkweeds. So if the milkweed starts to get predated upon, something starts to eat it, it can increase its cardinalate concentration to ward off those predators. And then sometimes that concentration is too high for the monarch to lay its egg on. And actually monarchs they can't see very well, but they can see the shape. They just like, oh, that looks like a milkweed. And so they'll land on it, and they have sensors in their feet, and they can, like, quote unquote, taste it, and they can tell the concentration of cardinalate in that milkweed and determine if it's acceptable or not for them to lay an egg on. It's just fascinating. So he goes into all that in monarchs and milkweed. If you're at all interested in that, I highly recommend it. And here are a few publications that Xerces provides. This can also be found from the link xerces.org or from the Illinois NRCS pollinator page. And they have one on native milkweeds for the central United States region and other regions in the nation. And one you might be interested in, Milkweeds, a Conservation Practitioner's Guide, Plant Ecology, Seed Production Methods, and Habitat Restoration Opportunities. Again, xerces.org is a great resource for all kinds of information about insects. So, well, I encourage you all to go out there and plant some wonderful monarch habitat. It's spring now, and this is just a great time to start thinking about planting a garden. Thank you so much for your time.